Good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Stuart Barclay. I'm the General Manager of Marketing at Wine Australia. It's my pleasure today to welcome you all to this EMDG grants webinar. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, EMDG, Export Market Development Grants, are really a hot topic for all exporters, and especially so in the agribusiness sector. And I'm pleased to be joined by our experts, Sam and Thomas from SW, who will take you through the latest developments of the EMDG. But before we start, I'd just like to take you through some housekeeping. We recommend that you click on the Enter Full Screen button at the top right-hand corner to achieve the best webinar experience today. If you click the Q&A button, a window will pop up that will allow you to send us questions as we go. We will monitor these and answer any that we can during the presentation. Some we will save for the Q&A at the end of the session, but for more bespoke questions, we may need to connect with you directly. Before we kick off, we are running 2 live polls today. The first poll question will appear on your screen now and can be accessed at any time using the poll button at the bottom of your screen. Once you answer the question, it will disappear. We will share the results with you later in the session. A second poll question will emerge during the Q&A piece, so watch out for that. Now, with the housekeeping done, I'd just like to introduce Sam Morris, Director, and Thomas Demmel, Senior Manager of R&D, Tax and Government Incentives at SW. Sam Morris is a tax and advisory specialist. She leads SW's National Research and Development Tax and Government Incentives team. Sam also chairs the Agribusiness Industry Group, combining her commercial skills with a strong focus on supporting the unique challenges of Australian agriculture. She has clients across many different subsectors of agribusiness, including horticulture, wine, dairy, meat processing, plus supporting technologies and logistics. Sam works closely with clients and advisors to deliver commercially focused strategies and solutions in an easy to understand and straightforward manner, with a focus on growth and innovation. Thomas is an R&D tax government incentive specialist with more than 10 years experience in IT and innovation consulting, both in Australia and the UK. During this time, he's helped more than 80 startup, SME and large multinational corporations across a wide range of industries access the RD&E tax incentive, export market development grant, and other government funding. This includes managing required governance processes, liaise with regulators, identify and provide opportunities for accessing different sources of government funding. Thomas has a passion for innovation and uses his prior experience in managing and leading technology projects to provide insight and advice on robust governance processes for accessing the RD&A tax incentives and other funding opportunities. So with that, over to you, Sam and Thomas, for today's presentation.
That's great. Thanks, Stuart. We're really pleased to be partnering with Wine Australia today to discuss export market development grants. Over the course of the last year in particular, we've been working with a number of wineries in relation to the diversification strategy. And naturally, a large part of this has been in the context of exports in light of the pandemic. Particularly given approximately 60% of Australian wine that's produced is exported. It's probably fair to say that the whole world is looking at diversification right now with the impact of COVID-19. So having a well thought out plan is really crucial. And the most important aspects of this, both from a financial perspective as well as strategic. Most common markets that I think the wine sector are looking at diversifying into key states of the USA, Canada, UK and Southeast Asia, with Japan being a significant market. I think financially supporting activities can be a much needed boost through the EMDG programme, so we're certainly timely to be looking at that today. So what is EMDG? The Export Market Development Grant Programme is the federal government's flagship programme. It's basically designed to support exporters. In particular, it's administered by Austrade. I believe we might have some of the representatives from Austrade online, so welcome to you. And if you have any comments or perspectives through an Austrade lens, please feel free to add those to the Q&A as well. The aim of the EMDG is to provide financial support to exporters and aspiring exporters to help promote goods, services, IP and know-how in overseas markets. And unlike most government incentives, the EMDG programme is what's called eligibility based. That means that if you're eligible and meet the criteria, you're entitled to funding. It's not a competitive programme as such, but there are caps on the total funding that's essentially allocated to the programme. Been around in a number of guises for many years, as you can see there, since 1974, and has helped probably around 4,000 to 5,000 businesses per year at any given time. I guess that leads us on to the current state of play with EMDG. It's changing. So we're currently going through a transition period for expenditure incurred up to the 30th of June 2021. And there's still time to claim under the reimbursement scheme that some of you will be familiar with already. But from 1st of July 2021 expenditure, the idea is that the EMDG is more forward-looking and will give essentially greater certainty for applicants. As you're probably aware from those that have made applications before, EMDG can be pretty complicated. The programme is changing. We probably anticipate that there could be further changes coming as the programme sort of gets going. So I think the first year is always a little bit of a test, I guess, and I'm sure there'll be refinements as we go through. We've had ongoing dialogue with our contacts at Austrade. We've attended a number of their sessions for advisors. It's probably fair to say that they too are grappling with the new programme, how it applies, how it'll be administered, and there's certainly been some difficulties with the new online portal, which seems to have a few gremlins still. So obviously people are working through those. But the new programme's here. We're already going through a transitional phase, I guess we're in it. So as I mentioned before, from the 1st of July 2021, EMDG is a lot more forward-looking, with applicants being required to enter into grant agreements, which will specify the grant amount per year. Whilst the eligibility has remained fairly consistent with prior years for those familiar with the programme, the new programme's made it easier for representative bodies to claim. Now, a representative body is basically a member-based organisation that doesn't export products, but rather is a promoter of an advocate of its members' products. So, for example, a regional wine association that's undertaking promotional activities for its members or providing training activities to its members, really helping them to become export ready. They would be in this classification of representative bodies. Representative bodies will be able to apply for 2 or 3 year grants of up to $150,000 per year. And importantly, unlike exporters who are limited by the number of years that they can be supported by EMDG, representative bodies are not limited in the number of years. It's important to note, however, that they'll only be able to have one grant agreement that's running at any one time. So, for example, if you lock into 3 years at, say, $50,000, you're unable after year 1 to apply to increase that to $150,000 under the current rules. I guess it's yet to be seen whether you can terminate an agreement and then re-enter. That'll be something that I'm sure will be certainly asked in the coming months and years. So just a bit of a scene setting, I guess, for the programme. I'm now going to hand over to Thomas, who's going to take you through some of the finer details around eligibility, both in terms of exporters themselves and the activities that would qualify under the EMDG programme. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, brilliant. So I guess as Sam already mentioned, in terms of the eligible exporters are different from actually representative bodies, and eligible exporters basically can apply for 3 separate tiers. I guess really the tiers depend on the export journey. Normally, I guess if you have a linear journey, you would really be new to exporting. You will try to build your skills and start really with your export promotional activities. At some point, then you hit the time when you're expanding your export activities, and maybe at some point, if you are have expanded a lot, you may actually think about a strategic shift where you already found out it could make sense, maybe add in a separate product or target a separate customer group or even another market. So the different tiers basically represent this kind of strategy. And whilst there are separate tiers, so that provide separate funding. So for example, if you're new to export, you can get up to $40,000 per financial year, and the funding agreement is for 2 years. The expanding tier, the tier 2, is actually bigger. It provides up to $80,000 per financial year for 3 years. And then obviously the biggest tier would be if you're expanding and do a strategic shift. So that's actually 150,000 per year. What's really important to understand is that you don't actually have to go through this journey in a linear fashion. You may already be exporting, and you may have actually accessed EMDG already, so you may not fit into tier 1 anymore. But it's really important to notice that it's really the length of a grant agreement and what you're trying to achieve during that time. What's really important to notice, the maximum amount of years that you can receive funding is 8 years. So that means if you go through in a linear fashion, you would apply once for tier 1, you apply once for tier 2, and you would apply for once for tier 3. But that may not be the case for you. You may actually be quite much longer on that tier 2, where you're really just trying to expand. So the cap for this is really 8 grant years, and there's an amount that's 770,000 Australian dollars. That's really important to note. In tier 1, really to start exporting, what you need to do is show that you have the appropriate skills to really start these export promotional activities. And there's an export readiness tool from Austrade. So if you go through that, it will basically, based on a couple of questions, will give you an answer if you may be ready for it. You may also be ready for it if you actually have attended export readiness training, and that could be, for example, be attended if a representative bodies where you're a member in supplies that actually, so you may actually participate in that. I already mentioned tier 3, and I already mentioned it's quite broad in terms of what a strategic shift means. It could really mean a separate country, but if you have a large market like the US, it could even mean a different part of the country. So it's quite broad. I guess moving on in terms of what you are or what kind of entities could apply. Sam already mentioned representative bodies, and that's really if you're an industry group that tries to, I guess, enable export promotional activities really for their member base. So they need to have a connection to the same type of product. You also have exporters, obviously, itself. And there are a couple of, I guess, requirements there. First of all, you need to be relatively, it's target for SMEs. So not if you're already well established, have exported for many, many years, and maybe just not have claimed. So the turnover there needs to be less than 20 million for the financial year. That's actually different for the retrospective scheme where it was 50 million. Obviously, you need to have an Australian business number. you haven't previously accessed the 8 years of EMDG grants, and that even applies if you have claimed before for EMDG. If you already accessed all these 8 years, you couldn't apply just for the new scheme and it starts again. That's not the case. It's quite broad in terms of who can apply. It's really specified as an Australian person. So it could be, in most cases, it will be a company, but obviously then you have representative bodies. You can also have trusts and individuals as well. Just moving on in terms of what products are actually eligible. And it's quite broad generally. So you can have goods like really physical goods here. You could be exporting grapes. You could be exporting wine. If you go into other areas, you could be exporting machinery. So a lot of like physical goods here. It could be IT hardware devices. It's very quite broad. If you talk about other kind of types of products, we have services, and they're actually a little bit of a distinction just because of the similarity. So you have tourism services, like for example, a restaurant here in Australia. It may be paid tours or paid entries to a certain place. It could also be accommodation, really quite broad. So services in terms of tourism services, quite broad. Could also cover events as well, like concerts. And then you have non-tourism related services. And that could be, for example, if you are an engineering kind of consulting firm, you may be creating designs and work with your customers. There are different requirements to it, and I'll go into that in a moment. In terms of then what other types of products, you have events, and that's really about promotional events. So promoting Australian products to international customers. You have intellectual property or know-how. So there may be, for example, certain knowledge that you create about certain processes that you may be able to share and that you may be able to protect as well. It could also be software that you develop here in Australia. In relation to these kind of different eligible products, they need to meet another requirement. And that's really, they need to be substantially of Australian origin. And what that really means, so for a good, it could be, I mean, first of all, it could be a primary good. So it could be grapes that you grow here, harvest here. So that would be one example for a primary good. But if we're talking, for example, about kind of a hardware device, about machinery, it would be, for example, a good that that is really, I guess, first of all, where it's manufactured or assembled here from components they're really sourced in Australia or created in Australia, or really undergo a significant transformation in Australia. So really, it's about the value add, and that it's mainly happens here in Australia. There could be obviously a part of that that happens outside of Australia, but it's really key that the value add mainly happens to make it saleable, happens here in Australia, and also that there's a significant job creation here with it. In terms of the services, I already mentioned the tourism services, and you obviously provide them to foreigners, and they are from Australian origin, especially if they're obviously based here. But in terms of the other services, there are actually a few more requirements. So first of all, you would expect that the assets to actually create that service are based here in Australia, or mainly based here, and also that the activities to provide or to make that service ready for sale actually are carried out here in Australia. There may obviously be elements where part of that service is provided outside of Australia, but it really comes back to that, where's the significant value creation happening? Is it in Australia, which is one of the requirements, and also does it create significant employment here? I guess conscious of time, and obviously I already mentioned a lot about the events. It's about supplying to international customers. During COVID, obviously, you had a lot of those events happening online, but it's important that it's provided by an Australian person. IP know-how, just quickly to add, trademark first needs to be used in Australia. and for both of the trademark and the software, it needs to be a result of a substantial research work done here in Australia. Just moving on of what expenses are actually eligible. So that's actually quite a few different ones. You may decide to have a staff member relatively permanently based overseas or hire somebody overseas. If that's for longer than 6 months in a financial year, then it's really meets the criteria of an overseas representative. In terms of how it becomes eligible, if that person actually undertakes promotional activities overseas and does research into the foreign market. In terms of the expenditure type, it's really salaries and wages. Could also be office rental, like office space rental, but it could also be the relocation. There are things that are not eligible, and one example is it's really like commission-based, sales-based, commission-based. Other types of expenditure, really, if a staff member undertakes short trips to a foreign country, they may visit potential customers, they may attend a trade show in a foreign market. It's not the salary that actually is eligible. It would be the costs that come with the travel. So it could be the flights, it could be accommodation, it could be ground transportation and meals. Same kind of applies to short trips within Australia. If you have staff members attending a trade show here that is specifically targeted to promote to foreign buyers, these kind of trips or the transportation that comes with it, like accommodation, domestic flights, can be included. Per trip, it's basically up to 21 days of continuous travel. They can be included, and it applies to both the short trips within Australia and outside of Australia. And you have a couple of other places where this is also the case. So for example, you have a category of foreign buyer visits, and that's really where you bring in a foreign buyer to actually demonstrate them your product here in Australia. And it may be just because it may be kind of impossible to really show them your product by shipping it over, maybe just too expensive. And especially when you talk about maybe machinery. So up to 21 days of continuous days of foreign buyer visits can be claimable in terms of like accommodation, flights to bring them over, and so on. One very common expenditure category are consultants. That's really marketing consultants. So if you engage somebody to do research into a foreign market, maybe develop pricing strategies for you, or even work on the design of marketing materials, this is one of the examples that can be claimed as well. But it's really specific to a foreign market, not obviously to Australians. Again, you may decide to attend trade fairs, for example, in a different country. So if you are soliciting for business in a foreign country this way, there are costs that can be included here as well. And this would be, for example, shipping your equipment over, or really entry fees to this trade fair, but also like booth rental to really display, for example, your variety of wines. You may also provide free samples to different customers, and that's really to evaluate your product. So it's not as a goodie that comes with a sale. So if you provide free samples, these can be claimed at the costs of producing them, plus the freight charges. In terms of wine, there's a bit of a cap there, and that's traditionally has been $5 per bottle, but that's kind of where the cap sits. Obviously, one of the most common categories here is also like the promotional and advertising material in itself. And that could be quite a variety of things. It could be brochures in a foreign language targeted in a foreign market. It could be a part of your website that you set up for a foreign market, maybe also in a foreign language. And social media, obviously, is another example that is also quite broad. You may decide to protect your intellectual property. It's probably a good idea, and your trademarks in a foreign market. So obviously lawyers are expensive. This is one of the examples that can be included together with the actual application costs. For companies new to export, but also for representative bodies, can claim for training activities. So really getting your staff trained up in promotional activities, into marketing activities. This is one of the expenditure that can be included to actually get them like externally provided training. And that also applies to representative bodies that may be engaging somebody external to provide training to their members. So that really covers the expenditure categories. I'm just handing over to Sam to really talk a bit more about how you could apply.
Thanks, Thomas. Okay, so how do we apply? For the new programme, we're looking at expenditure, as we say, from the 1st of July. So it's anticipated expenditure for the next 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3 financial years. Importantly, the closing date for applications is the 30th of November this year. So there's been no suggestion that this will be extended, and certainly Austrade communications and guidelines say that that is a strict deadline and applications will not be accepted after that time. The idea essentially is that the applications are assessed and then grant agreements are issued to provide applicants with some degree of certainty as early as possible as to what their entitlement will be. The application is made through the government portal. You'll need to provide a number of different pieces of documentation and information about your business when making an application. So there's the key things are evidence of eligibility, so showing that you're actually eligible for the programme itself. Evidence that the product that you're looking to claim for, or the services, is eligible. For example, as Thomas mentioned, substantially of Australian origin. I think for our winery clients, that should be fairly straightforward. Evidence as to the turnover requirement being less than 20 million, unless you're a representative body. For some of the larger groups out there, that might be, I guess, ironically, easier to satisfy the 20 million for, because you're providing evidence of the last financial year, which has no doubt been a bit of a struggle for many businesses. And there's a number of details on your business structure, so what type of entity are you, etc., providing details that you've got an ABN, a lot of the eligibility that Thomas mentioned previously. And importantly, a plan to market. So you might be wondering what a plan to market is. This is essentially where some of the hard work comes in, and it's what I'd class as the accountability piece. So you need to be describing your strategic goals for expansion into overseas markets, whether this is for the first time that you've exported or whether you are growing and diversifying your export markets. Many businesses are very familiar with developing business plans and setting goals and reporting against targets, etc. But we also find it's quite common for businesses simply to, I'd probably say, have a good idea and just start trying to make the magic happen. So it's important, this is a very important step and sets out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. The guidelines at this stage are actually quite, they seem quite generous. They say, this can be anything from a one-pager to almost a full-blown business plan and things that you would ordinarily do in the course of business. I guess that might be something that evolves over time, and there might be increased rigor around what you're actually saying in those documents. I thought it might be helpful to give a bit of a step plan as to how the full process is intended to play out. So after you've put together and lodged your application before the 30th of November, Austrade will then undertake their assessments. As I mentioned before, there's an allocated pool of funds. So essentially, if you're eligible, you will be entitled effectively to funding, but there is a finite pot, and then effectively if there's oversubscription, Austrade will divide up the funds amongst the eligible applicants. You'll then be issued with a grant agreement that would detail the amount of funding that you would receive each year, and importantly what your obligations are. The key one for the obligations will be the co-contribution. So I think this is not free money as such, it's just a contribution towards your expenditure. So you need to be in a position to be at least co-contributing on a one-for-one basis. You then go off and undertake your promotional activities, as Thomas mentioned, a number of those and how they would be eligible and apply. And it's really important to ensure you keep on top of what activities are eligible. You will be asked to support those bits of expenditure in the milestone reporting. So as an example, if you have a grant agreement for 100,000 and you spend the required 200,000 being effectively what would be yours and the government's contributions, but some of the costs are not eligible for the programme, effectively your milestone payment will be reduced accordingly. So it's important to make sure that whatever you're doing actually continues to be eligible for the programme. And probably important to appreciate that with the milestones that there are reports that will be required to be lodged and evidence of what you've actually done and spent the money on. You won't necessarily receive all of the amount of money that you apply for. As I say, there's a finite pot that will be distributed amongst eligible applicants. But what you should receive is what's included in your grant agreement. So provided that you've spent the required money, you spent it on eligible activities, if it's in your grant agreement, then you should receive that. The grant agreement itself should specify the timing of those payments that will be made to you. So you might be thinking there's quite a lot involved in the process, and you're probably right in thinking that. The EMDG process has always been quite complicated, we've certainly been through a lot of reviews with Austrade of prior year claims, for example, and there's a lot of evidence provision required. The introduction of the application details, in particular the plan to market, will no doubt result in probably additional complexities for applicants, particularly if you don't readily have a documented export strategy. We can certainly help in every step of the way with these processes and lodgements. We know that there are still some bugs with the portal, as I mentioned before. We are in regular contact with Austrade, so it should be able to iron out any of those issues along the way. I think that's all we really had to say today. Might just hand back to Stuart, and we've got some Q&A.
Thanks, Sam and Thomas. Look, I think that's a really good update on EMDG. It has changed. It has always been a complex creature, and it's got some complexities with this new structure. So thanks for taking everyone through that. I think one of the key questions that will emerge is, and I know somebody's actually raised this as part of the Q&A, is very much, will the EMDG be provided upfront based on applications, or do we need to spend the money first and get reimbursed later? So that's a common question that I hear every single day. So if you can answer that in a moment, but just to remind everyone, we've also got a second poll that's going to appear very shortly from Kate. So if you could answer that, that'd be great. But just going back to that question, Sam and Thomas, if you can just sort of reiterate the way that you apply is part of a grant, not that reimbursement later, please.
It's a very common question, and I think there's been quite a lot of misconception in this. A lot of advertising and social media and things that I saw in the early days of this were suggesting that it was an upfront payment. whereas actually it's an upfront grant agreement. So it's effectively setting out an agreement with government as to what they will provide based on you spending the money. So it will be a retrospective payment once you've spent the money, but it will be agreed to in advance, effectively.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it's that's where I think a lot of wineries will probably need a fair amount of guidance and support. So if there's any questions coming out post this, please contact us at Wine Australia, or even goes directly to Sam and Thomas at SW. We've got a few other questions coming through. And they are, well, how will Austrade know if I have spent the money? I said I would when I applied.
Yeah, good question again. The requirements are really around the milestone reporting. So yes, the application will set out what you intend to spend and what you intend to spend it on. But there will be a process at the end of each year effectively to verify that you have actually spent the money. The expectation would be that there'd be a short declaration, and then Austrade may ask for invoices and that type of thing. I think I'm expecting it's a little bit like going through an EMDG audit has been previously, or review, which is basically where Austrade would say, give me all the evidence as to what you've spent and how you've gone about it. So yes, we won't be able to do a dodgy and not spend as much as we say we're going to.
Cool, thanks, Sam. Another question that's come through is, can we apply for the grant if we are still in the process of getting an export license?
That's a really good question. I'm not so sure I know the answer to that. I would have thought that going through the readiness tool that Austrade have got that's probably one of the questions. Thomas might know the answer to this, because I know Thomas looks in detail at these things.
I would think probably nothing stops you so much from applying, but when you actually start spending the money, or you probably won't be able to spend the money before you actually have the export license. And then obviously after the year, when you submit the milestone report, you will actually be, well, you will know at some point, will you be able to start your activities that you planned or not? And it may be the case that you have applied for the grant applications, and during that time, whilst you're waiting for actually that agreement, that you actually get your export license. So what's important to note really is the deadline for application for each year, because there's no kind of, I guess there's a deadline. So by the end of November, you need to apply for it. Otherwise, you would be missing out for next year.
Yeah, I would think subject to how quickly licenses come through. I wouldn't see the downside in applying. There's no downside in applying, other than the time and effort taken to do that. But as Thomas says, if you don't apply, you've got to wait another year effectively.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Look, from a export license perspective, I wouldn't see that as a hindrance here. I think put your application in, getting your export license is relatively straightforward. It involves a little bit of paperwork, but it's not onerous. And the Wine Australia export team can talk you through that process of getting that license. There's a really interesting question that's come through from one of our state wine associations. Can the matched funds come from a state government grant?
Well, the answer to that is no. You need to spend the money, and they can't come from another government source.
Usually other state government grants as well would have a co-contribution element to them. So there are some that don't, but most would have a co-contribution that needs to come from either yourselves or potentially debt funding, that type of thing.
Thanks, Sam. Again, here's another really interesting question. It's on eligibility. I have historically been unable to claim, even though a new business that has never claimed. As I own an IP trademark that was in a different historic entity that had 8 claims. Under the new rules, is there any change to this eligibility? So the IP sat in a different entity, but the owner has never been able to claim.
No, the answer is there hasn't been any change. It's really kind of the test. Is it basically the same business? Do you supply the same products? So if you have already claimed kind of maybe with the different entities, but you have a change of name or maybe a change of owner, but for that kind of type of product and so on, you have claimed before, then you wouldn't be able, it wouldn't be reset. There wouldn't be a reset. You wouldn't start from scratch.
Okay. Here's a question for you, Thomas. What do you mean by the fact that you can't have a, sorry, what do you mean by you can't have applied for the last 8 grants? There's a comment you made earlier in the presentation.
It's basically there's a 8-year cap, really. You can't, well, sorry, I guess where the question comes from, that's a really good question. So if you have previously applied for the retrospective EMDG program, so really the expenses you have already incurred, and then you get reimbursed for 50% of the expenditure. So if you already maxed out that kind of 8 grand cap, just by now having a new EMDG program, you wouldn't be able to now start from scratch. So it wouldn't be a reset to say, okay, there's now a new program out there. There has been a change, obviously, in the mechanism of the program. It has been revised completely, but it's still the EMDG program. So it doesn't mean you're now, I guess, can again apply for year 1.
There's essentially a matching that happens essentially behind the scenes, which says that you know, if you've applied in the past, irrespective of really how long ago, and it's the same business, then those numbers of years that you've had grants for previously under EMDG are counted. So if you've already had 8, as Thomas says, you won't get any going forward. But if you've had 3, 4, 5, then there's still some scope there to apply.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. Here's another sort of question around co-contribution. If you spend $10,000 on an export readiness program and then get $5,000 from another grant, can you claim 50% of the remaining cost out of your own pocket expense to reduce, so that reduces to $2,500 that you claim from EMDG? So can you run it alongside other grants? I think is the question.
You should be able to, as long as you're only claiming through EMDG 50% of what you've spent that's not been grant funded. Would you agree with that, Thomas?
I would think so, yeah.
Cool, thank you. And then there's, I think there's still a little bit of confusion about this question around, is EMDG provided upfront based on application, or do we need to spend money first? And I think, as we've already said, it is an application upfront, and then there's eligibility around what you have spent.
That's right. So if we look at it on a timeline, given, you know, we started with 1 July, there'll be businesses having already been spending money, and that's fine. They'll then apply before the 30th of November, enter into a grant agreement at some time after that, and presumably sometime around 30 June 2022, there would be the milestone reporting happens, showing what's been spent and proving eligibility of that expenditure, and then the grant money should follow.
Cool. Thank you, Sam. I'm also just conscious of time. It's 2:46, so I think we've got time for one more question here, and it's again from a representative association. Is the time and monetary cap also applied to representative associations?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's very pleasing actually for representative associations. The annual monetary cap is 150,000, and typically there'd be 2 or 3 year grant agreements for that capped amount. But we don't go back in time and look at the 8 years, etc. So there's no capping on the number of years that representative bodies can apply, mainly because they're supporting lots of different members. So it's not their business as such. But as I think I mentioned, they can only have one grant agreement running at any one time. So if, for example, and I think this is where we'll probably see organisations applying for the maximum that they think they're going to spend, or the maximum that they're able to spend, and to get some funds back for, because I think there'll be difficulties in upping the grant amount in the future. When you're locked into an agreement, you can only have one at any one time.
Thanks. And I think we've just got time. There's one really interesting question here, which Sam, I think you'll be able to answer, or even Thomas. Our company was approved for an EMDG grant under the previous program and had included 2 years worth of expenses in the first application. Is our company eligible to apply for the new EMDG program before 30/11/21, given we have only had one EMDG application approved?
Yep. So you could apply if you've had nothing approved in the past. You could be completely new to EMDG. I think what's just important there is, under the previous reimbursement program, there was a concession that allowed you in your first grant application to include 2 years worth of expenditure. That only basically is one grant year. So, for example, with the business that just asked that question, when we're looking at the 8-year cap, we'd be including just 1 year that they've already accessed, not 2, even though they've had expenditure for 2 due to that initial concession. So they'd have 7 years effectively left to run through the new program.
Thanks, Sam and Thomas. I think it's 2:49, so we'll probably need to start closing this up. But thank you, Sam and Thomas, for your presentations this afternoon. For those who have any follow-up questions, we have still a few questions in the system that we will answer directly, but please follow us up directly either at Wine Australia or directly to Sam and Thomas at SW.